Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of the first book of Kings, that is Malachim Aleph. We are up to Perek Tet Zion, that is chapter 16. We left chapter 15, where the split between the northern tribes and the northern kingdom and the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin and the southern kingdom was solidified. The reign of the first king Yeravam ben Nevat, his son Nadav, had been overthrown by Baasha, and Baasha was now the king in the north. We mentioned that Baasha was evil, a bad king. He worshipped idols, continued the pattern that Yeravam set the northern kingdom on the bad path that they were on, and that a new king in the south arose named Asa, a descendant of the line of David, who turned things around and was whole with God and destroyed idol worship in the southern kingdom. Not perfect, but definitely a step in the right direction. And as a pattern, as we'll see, in the southern kingdom, while they were far, far from perfect and constantly also falling into traps like the northern brethren, there was glimmers of hope. There was always, some moves in the right direction. They went back down, up, whereas the north, it was all down. So we start the 16th parak, where you have Baasha as the king of the north, an evil king. You have Asa as the king of the south, and you have the two parties warring against each other, constant war between the two nations. So that's the setting at which chapter 16 begins, and we will continue to see the descent of the northern kingdom into further chaos that just gets worse and worse and worse, until by the end of this chapter it'll at least politically get somewhat stabilized. And the southern kingdom, we'll see. So let's go ahead. Vayidvar Adonai el Yehu ben Chanani el Baasha lemar. And the word of God came to a prophet by the name of Yehu, the son of Hanani, and he prophesied to King Baasha as follows. It's clear, and as we've seen in the earlier chapters, that prophets were still prophesying. We saw how the prophet who was identified by tradition as Edo, but a nameless prophet, came to warn Yeravam. We saw how and now we're seeing how Yehu, so the God is still trying to move the people of the north in the right direction by sending them prophets. But they're not going in the right direction. They're not listening. And therefore, the prophet Yehu had the following words for Baasha. In the next chapter 17, and without giving away too much, we have the main prophet who prophesied to the north to try to bring them around back to God, of course, and that being Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, which we will spend a lot of time speaking about him, but not yet in this chapter. So God far from gave up on the north. So here you have Yehu. He is saying a prophecy to the king Baasha as follows: Ya'an asher harimosicha min ha'afar, because I brought you up from the dirt. Right? In other words, you are a nobody, and I made you into a somebody. I made you the king. V'etencha nagid al ami Yisrael. I made you the chief over my nation Israel. Nonetheless, Vatelech b'derech Yeravam, you followed in the path of Yeravam, Jeroboam. Vatachati et ami Israel, and you continued to cause my nation Israel to sin. Lahachiseni b'chatosam, in such a way that all you did was make me angry due to their sins. This is what you did. You continued on that path. Because of that, in other words, one infers from here that had Baasha turned the people around, then the fact that Baasha had destroyed the family of Yeravam would have been looked at as something good, as an achievement, as an accomplishment, had he then used the opportunity to turn the people around and bring them back to God. But instead, he did not, and therefore, Hineni, verse 3, Mavir acharei v'ashav acharei veito, therefore I am going to destroy. Ma'avir acharei, it seems like it's a language of, I'm not just going to destroy, but I'm going to search them out and continue to destroy, to get rid of them at the roots. V'acharei beiso, his entire family. V'nosati et beitcha, I'm going to make your house, you, the king of Baasha, the king, I'm going to make your house, Kibet Yeravam ben Nevat, it's going to be destroyed just like the house of Yeravam Jeroboam. Hamet lebasha ba'ir, the same language that was used in the prophecies regarding the house of Yeravam is now being used in the prophecies regarding Basha. Those that die from Basha's family in the city Yochlu Akilavim will be eaten by the stray dogs. Hamet lo basodeh, and those that die in the fields Yochlu of Hashemayim will be eaten by the vultures of the sky. V'yeter divrei Basha, and again, in the same pattern of the Book of Kings, it's not going to go into all of the details of all of the various accomplishments, achievements, failures, etc. of Basha's kingdom and what he did, what he enacted, the wars he fought, also the things he did, and the powerful things he did. Hello, if you really want to know about them, Halohim kituvim al sefer divrei hayomim l'malchei Yisrael. You can go and read about them just fine if you go ahead and read in the book, the history books of the kings of Israel. Vayishkav Basha im avotav, and Basha went to lay with his fathers. He passed on. Vayikover b'Tirza, and he was buried in what was then the capital of the northern kingdom, the city of Tirza, which had now been the capital since Yeravam's days. Since Vayimloch Elah v'no tachtav, and his son Elah became king after him. V'gam biyad Yehu ben Chanani hanovi dvar Adonai haya el Basha v'el beiso. But even though we saw somewhat of a little bit of a transition of power to the son, which is some level of a sign of stability, but it was over because in Yehu had a prophecy that which reflected the word of God regarding Basha and his family, and regarding Basha and his family and all of the evil that he had done in God's eyes, because he made him angry b'ma'asei yadav, with the actions of his hands. I know I've emphasized this before, but I'm going to continue to do so. That the key problem here is Yehu, I'm sorry, not Yehu, Basha. Obviously, we don't know exactly what he may have said things. He may have claimed to be praying to God, but the key here is that his ma'asei yadav, the actions of his hands, were liyot kebeis Yeravam, were like the house of the evil house of Jeroboam, v'alasher hika oto, and that which he had struck him, meaning in this case, in somewhat anthropomorphic terms, striking God, so to speak, by acting in this evil manner. So in other words, he's continued on this path. He continued going down this path. The other understanding of Al-Asher Ka'oto is that he had struck down the house of Yeravam. In other words, the fact that he had struck the house of Yeravam would have been something good had he then changed the path of the kingdom to the good. But because he did not, and he continued in the evil ways of Yeravam, now that which he had struck Yeravam is now looked upon as a sin, as something bad, because clearly he had no right to kill the family of Yeravam if all he was going to do was continue on the same path. So let's continue. Now we're going to flip for a little bit as we go back and forth so that we understand what's going on in the southern kingdom at this contemporaneous time. Bishnat Esrim Vashesh Shana, during the 26th year, La'asa Melech Yehuda, of the reign of Asa, the king of Yehuda, who, as we learned before, ruled for quite a long time, like 40 years. Malach Elah ben Basha, that is when Elah, the son of Basha, became the king al Yisrael b'Tirza Shnatayim, and he lasted as king for 2 years. But as we will see, he was a drunk and he was an evil king. Vayikshar Olav Avdo Zimri, he had a servant whose name was Zimri, who was Sar Machatzis Orechev. He was a general or a commander over half the chariots of the armies of the northern kingdom. So he was a powerful general in the army. V'hu b'tirza shoseh shikar, and he, the king Elah, was getting drunk in the capital, drinking wine, getting drunk. Beit Arza, in the house of Arza, Asher al Abayit b'tirza. Arza was one of his top men who was in charge of the king's palace's affairs, and the king was busy getting drunk in his house, and which made him vulnerable to an attempted coup. So Zimri saw the opportunity. Vayavo Zimri vayakeu vaymiseu. Zimri came, killed the king, struck him down. Bishnat Esrim Vasheva, and this occurred during the 27th year Asa Melech Yehuda of the reign of Asa, the king of Yehuda. Vayimloch tachtav, and Zimri thus seized the throne and made himself king. Vayi b'molcho, and when it was as soon as he became king, kishivto kiso, as soon as he sat on the throne, his first order of business was he called Beit Basha. He went and he killed all of the entire family of Basha. Lo ishir lo mashtin bekir. He did not leave a person alive, not a single male. Again, using this crude language, one who urinates against the wall, not a single male. Vigo alov v're'ehu, not a single relative, not even a single friend. So any supporter of the family of Basha who would have supported the king Elah, who he had just killed, were killed and gotten rid of by Zimri. Vayashmei Zimri at Kol Beit Basha. Zimri thus fulfilled the prophecy which had been given by God regarding the house of Basha, Kidvar Adonai Asher Diber El Basha B'Yad Yehu Hanavi, like the prophecy which God had given to Yehu the prophet. Et Kol Chatot Basha v'Chatot Elah Beno Asher Chatu. And the reason why this was done was because of all of the sins of Basha and all of the sins of Elah, his son, the drunk, Asher Chatu, that they sinned, Vasher Chatiu at Yisrael, and worse than that, that they brought the other Jewish people, the rest of Israel, to sin, La'achis, in such a way that all it resulted in angering at Adonai Elohim Yisrael Ba'avliam, angering God, the Lord of Israel, with their nonsense, with their false and terrible behavior, specifically referring here most likely to the idol worship. V'yeser divrei Elah, if you want to know anything else about Elah, again, v'chol asher asah Elohim ketuvim al sefer divrei hayomim l'malchi Yisrael. These are all written in the history books of the kings of Israel. If you're interested, go look there. But here, for the point of the book of Kings, this is enough for us to know. B'shnas esrim v'sheva, now, during the 27th year, Asa Melech Yehuda, of the king Asa of Judah, when all these events occurred up in the north, Malach Zimri Shivas Yamim. Zimri was only lasted as a king for 7 days, B'Tirza, in the town of Tirza, still remaining the capital. And during this time, Zimri, while he's sitting as the king, being busy taking his vengeance against Basha's family, the nation was involved in a war. They were encamped on Gibton, which was a Philistine city. The Philistines had, as we've seen in the last chapter, had started acting up again. Even though they were subdued by David, they started becoming an enemy again. And the nation was camped against them in battle. And Zimri, whose job was to be a general, to be the commander over half the chariots, who should have been involved in war, was involved in this nonsense of overthrowing the king and getting rid of his family. So that obviously didn't make him very popular with the people. So Vayishma ha'amach onim leimar, so the people that were there camped, the nation, the army, heard what had happened. They heard as follows, that Koshar Zimri, that Zimri rebelled against the king. And Avagam he Koshar is he conspired. That Zimri conspired. V'gam he got the melech. Not only did he plan, but he killed the king. Vayamlichu kol Yisrael. So they were kind of justifiably and quite understandably upset with their general, who's busy grasping power for himself instead of defending the people during a war. So Vayamlichu kol Yisrael, the people of Israel, the people decided that we needed another king, someone who actually fights for us. So they took at Omri, they made Omri the king, and he was the Sar Tzava al Yisrael Bayomahu Bamachaneh. He was the general of the army over the northern people of Israel. On that day, then he was Mamachaneh, he was in the camp. He was there. So that general showed that he was interested in the people and interested in fighting their fight and defending them against their enemies, as opposed to Zimri, who was only interested in himself. One interesting thing here is we see how the appointment of kings was not exactly democratic as we would call it today, but somewhat democratic to the extent that the people had a say in who they were going to make the king. We've seen this when King Saul was made king, the people accepted him. When David was made king, we see it here in the northern kingdom, that the people chose their leader, and they chose their leader based on his leadership qualities. He had already shown that he was a faithful and trustworthy leader. And we'll see that although Omri was not exactly the best, to put it mildly, in terms of how he worshipped God and how he led the people, but in terms of their spirituality, but in terms of being a powerful and strong and reliable leader, Omri was able to restore some level of stability to the kingdom, um, which we're going to see soon. And he did act in his people's best interest. At least that's what we can see. Vaya'ale Omri b'chol Yisrael imo migivton vayatzuru al tirza. So now, so they made Omri the king, but Zimri is still sitting on the throne in the capital Tirza. So Omri now, with all of the people of Israel, left Givton. They left the siege, where they were fighting the Philistines, and went back and now laid siege to the capital Tirza. Zimri ki nilkedah ha'ir, when Zimri saw that the city was surrounded and there was no hope for him against all of the army and Omri at their lead, he came to the palace citadel, the tall tower in the king's palace, and he burned down the entire palace, and he burned down the palace and died. So this is the kind of person who kind of followed a scorched earth policy. He burned the whole palace presumably with all of its wealth, maybe even with many of the people that served the palace inside, killing himself, but also depriving Omri of the symbolic victory of taking over the palace and beginning his rule there. So here you have Omri now starting without a palace and a devastated capital. And why did Zimri meet this end? Because of his sins that he'd sinned, because he also, even though he had only a very brief time as a king, he clearly continued in the path of Yeravam, and they continued in the path of Jeroboam, of Yeravam, to continue to make the people of Israel sin. So if you want to know anything else about the story of Zimri and his conspiracy, Vayesar divrei Zimri v'kishro asher kasha, and his plots, Aloim kituvim al sefer divrei hayamim l'Malachei Yisrael. You can go ahead and read the history books. The details are there. Now, that Omri has now been established as the king. He doesn't really have a capital, but he was made as the king by the people that had were encamped by the Philistines, and had then abandoned that battle and went to overthrow Zimri and place Omri as king. But now the people themselves became divided. Some wanted Omri, and some wanted someone else. And we'll see in a minute, verse 21. At that point, the people of Israel were split into two groups. Half the people wanted to appoint a man by the name of Tivni, the son of Ginat, to make him the king. And half wanted to make Omri the king. So in other words, we have now a civil war within the northern kingdom. It's hard to imagine a descent into chaos worse than this. First, there's a civil war between the north and the south. The north cannot seem to get their act together and establish a lasting, steady monarchy with a reliable, a reliable passage of command from generation to generation, with a reliable transfer of power. And now it's even worse. Now you have a civil war between two factions over who should be the king. And during this war, the Amri, the faction of the people that were following Omri, were stronger than Tivni ben Ginat. They were stronger than those who supported Tivni. Eventually Tivni died. It doesn't say that he was killed, it says that he died. It's unclear exactly what the circumstances of that death were, at least from the of his death were um, Vayimloch Omri, and then they made Omri the king. So now you have Omri taking over after Zimri, who Zimri himself was only king for a week. Zimri had killed out the Elah, the son of Basha, and Basha had killed out Nadav, the son of Yeravam, and that's the progression of the kings of the northern kingdom so far. And now you have Omri as the king. Bishnat Shloshim va'achat shana la'asa melech Yehuda. Let's flip to the south again. During the 31st year of the reign of Asa melech Yehuda, who had, as we mentioned above, a very long reign, very stable reign. During all this turmoil, the southern kingdom was a tremendous contrast. They had a stable ruler, a ruler that led the people back to God, etc. Malach Amri al Yisrael. Amri now became the king over Israel. Shtei Mesrei Shana. He was the king for 12 years. Betirza Malach Shalosh Sheishanim. However, he had his capital in the ruined city of Tirza for 6 years. He wanted to rebuild the capital, so he found another city, which Vayiken et Tahar Shomron made Shemer b'chikrayim Kosef. He went and he bought from a person by the name of Shemer the hill of Shomron, and this then, for the rest of history until today, the region is called Shomron, Samaria, and it was named Shomron because of the capital of this mountain, the mountain of Shomron, and that became the capital of the northern kingdom from now until the end of the northern kingdom, and why very often you have the phrase of Yehuda, of the country of Judah and the country of Shomron, because Shomron is the capital of all the northern tribes, and it's about to happen now. It was Omri that established a new capital in Shomron. He bought it from Shemer b'chikrayim Kosef with a significant amount of silver. Vayiven et Tahar, and he built up the mountain. He built the city up there. Vayikra Shem Meir Asher Bana, and the name of the city that he built, he called it Al Shem Shemer. He named it after the Shemer, who was the person he bought it from. Adonai Ahar, who was the owner, the original owner, he named it Shomron. So that's how it achieved its name, Shomron, because a guy named Shemer was the original owner. And interestingly, this is pointed out because Omri went and made a fair sale. Remember, Omri was placed in as a king because of a popular uprising. People wanted him to be king. And it makes sense that rather than expropriating land for himself, like we will find out his evil son Achav will do later, Omri went and bought it for a fair price and built up Shomron. And this is considered in general throughout tradition as a positive thing of Omri. However, Omri wasn't so positive overall, despite some of his positive acts, like we just read, as we'll see right now, verse 25. Vayaseh Omri hara be'enei Adonai, and Omri did evil in the eyes of God. Vayara mikol asher lefanav, and in ways he was even worse than all the people that preceded him. That was Omri. Vayelech b'chol derech Yeravam ben Nevat, and he went in all the ways that Yeravam had done, uv'chataso hasher achati etz Yisrael, and in the sins that he had made the people of Israel sin. This is a phrase which we've heard over and over again, lahachis es Adonai Eloi Yisrael b'havlehem, in such a way as to make God angry with all of their nonsense, with all of their false gods, etc. It would seem that the Mikol Asher Lefanav, and this is just something that seems to come out of the context, and as we read about Achav and his particular evil, it'll kind of be fulfilled, and that is that it seems that the earlier kings, although they had other temples and so on, they were still at least nominally worshiping God. They were worshiping the God who brought the people out of Egypt. They were still maintaining that practice of worshiping God. Although they had it messed up, they didn't go to the proper temple. They had made their own temples. They made a calf. So it was a very messed up understanding. But they were still worshiping God. But now Omri seems to have been bringing people closer, which is why we started saying Bahavlehem. He was leading the people in their false gods, in their false nonsense, their false worshiping. which is the slippery slope that started with Yeravam and brought the people eventually to what we find with Achav, where he openly brought the worship of Baal, brought it into the population and made that the worship of the people. So it turned people away from God and towards a idol. So so that would why it seems that Omri continued that path in a bigger way and made idol worship even more entrenched in the northern kingdom. V'yeser divrei Omri asher asa, and the other things, again, the same as we said with the other kings, other things that Omri had done, ugvuraso asher asa, and whatever accomplishments and achievements he had in battle. Halohim ksuvim al sefer divrei hayamim l'malchei Yisrael. Feel free, go read it in the history books. Interestingly, Omri is another king who is famously mentioned in extra biblical contemporaneous sources in the Mesha Stela, all right, the Stele. I always miss how to pronounce that. A famous archaeological find in which Omri is mentioned there, and his how he conquered Moab. And this is something which is another place where one of the kings, and he's mentioned specifically Omri, the king of Israel, in an extra biblical source. So this is again another place where we have the historical record corroborating what we find in the Bible. Now, Vayishkav Omri Mavotav. Eventually, Omri, of course, passed on with his fathers. Vayikaver b'Shomron. He ended up buried in Shomron, while the other kings of Israel were buried in Tirzah. Vayimloch Achav beno Tachtav, and Achav, his son, became king after him. Now, Achav, we're going to read a lot about Achav. Right now, we're just going to finish off this chapter with just a few introductory facts about Achav. But we're going to have a lot to talk about Achav during the coming chapters, and he's going to be one of the main characters in the drama that's going to unfold in the next few chapters. So here we are being introduced to him and being told what kind of a person he is. V'Achav ben Omri malach al Yisrael b'shnas 38 shana le'asa melech Yehuda. Achav, the son of Omri, became king during the 38th year of the reign of Asa Melech Yehuda. So Asa has been king while this entire time, while in the north it keeps bouncing back and forth from one king to another to another. So Achav became king near the end of Asa's reign, at his 38th year. Vayimloch Achav ben Omri al Yisrael b'Shomron, and Achav, the son of Omri, became king over the people of Israel, and his capital was in Shomron. Esther Mushtayim Shana, he was the king for 22 years. Vayas Achav ben Omri hara be'enei Adonai mikol asher lefanav. He did evil in the eyes of God, even worse than anyone before him. In other words, even worse than his father Omri, who was said to be even worse than the people before him. Vayehi hanokel lechto. And it was that, and this word hanokel is an interesting one to translate, but basically it comes from the word kal, which means light, which means the lightest things, right, that he did was go. In other words, the least that he did bad was going b'chatot Yeravam ben Nevat, was continuing in the sins of Jeroboam, of Yeravam. But he did worse than that, because why? What did he do? Vayikach isha et Izevel bat et Baal melech Sidonim. He married the king of the Sidonim from Sidon, the Phoenician people. They had a king named Et Baal, who is the king and named after the idol of the people of the Phoenicians, which is the idol of Baal. And Izevel, his daughter, Achav took her in as a wife, thus bringing in the worship of Baal and making it the official religion. So here, Omri had allowed the people to descend into idol worship. Achav made it even worse by bringing it in and making it into the state religion. So here we have Yeravam wanting the people to worship God, but just not in the temple. And eventually it sunk and it sunk and it sunk to the point where all of us, now people aren't even worshiping God anymore, and we're going to see how bad this will get. And he, meaning Achav, abandoned God and went and worshipped Baal and bowed to Baal. Vayokem is Beach Baal, Beit Baal, and he went and he made a altar to Baal. So here now he's putting up a house of idol worship, Asher Bana b'Shomron, that he built in his capital of Shomron. Vayas Achav et Asherah, and Achav went and he built an Asherah, which is a shrine to the female consort of Baal. Remember, there was Baal, who's the husband god, who's the one who is also the god of rain, who brings fertility and seeds to the land, and also is the symbol of the male bringing fertility to the woman. And then the Asherah is the woman who brings out either the produce from the land or the children from her womb. This is the basis of this cult of Asherah and Baal. And so Achav built up the Asherah, Vayosef Achav la'asos, and he continued and got even worse, la'achises Adonai Elohei Yisrael, to anger God, the Lord of Israel, Mikol Malchei Yisrael Lefanav, even worse than any of the kings of Israel that preceded him. And he's doing this at a time when the southern kingdom is returned to God. So here we have a tremendous contrast. We have Achav, the king, who is establishing a national religion of idol worship at a time when the southern kingdom has reestablished and devoted itself again to the true national religion of God and monotheism. And at this time, thrown in at the last verse of this chapter, is an interesting fact. And it harkens back to the beginning days of when the people had conquered, had entered the land. When the people of Israel entered the land under the leadership of Joshua, the first town that they conquered was Jericho. And if you recall back then, and I suggest to you, if you don't, go back and listen to the podcasts that I taught back then, that Joshua made a cherem, he made a decree, a curse, on anyone who would ever come and rebuild Jericho. Jericho was to be left desolate as a monument to remember, to help the people remember the conquest that God had over that God brought the people in and helped them conquer the land from the Canaanites. Now, if back then I explained the purpose and point of that was to show that we are not attacking and coming into this land because we want to win booty, because we want to get rich, because we want to get. However, we are doing it because God is giving us this land, and we are here for a reason and for a purpose, to establish a new idea, a new way of worshiping God, a new way of worshiping God in a proper and appropriate way, without the corruption, without the promiscuity, without the abuse of other human beings and human sacrifice, without the terrible corruption which comes about, and the arrogance which comes about, which we've went into in detail in many of these podcasts, because of the practices of the polytheists of the time. The leaving Jericho was that symbol. Leaving Jericho alone was there to show that we didn't just come here to conquer goods. Remember how people were not allowed to take any of the goods, any of the wealth that was left in Jericho. It had to remain there. We didn't do. That's not the reason for us building up this place. And now that Achav has brought the people full circle from that grand notion of establishing a new idea, a worldwide idea that the entire world can work together in peace, and where there's one God, where we can all have the same unity of purpose. There's a reason, there's a purpose for us being here, that we have to act in a certain way. It's not about sacrificing and appeasing this God, that, or that God, or the other one. It's about doing and living the kind of life that the one Creator has asks us to do, because He made the world for us to live in justice and righteousness, etc. Right? It was a new idea. And Achav symbolizes the absolute failure of that mission. We went full circle all the way from that grand idea to this terrible, terrible failure. Therefore, it makes sense that at this time somebody would go and rebuild Jericho, because all of a sudden we're no different than anyone else. We conquered this land just like every other nation that conquers another nation for selfish reasons. Biyamav, in his day, in Achav's day, Bona Chiel Beita Eli at Jericho. Chiel, who was from Beitel, he went and rebuilt Yericho. Interestingly, Yericho is in the territory of the southern kingdom. So there's clearly people going back and forth from the southern to the northern kingdom, people buying property from the southern to the northern kingdom and back and forth. And at the expense of Aviram Bechoro Yista, at the expense of Aviram, his firstborn, who died, presumably, and it's understood to be at the as a result of of breaking Joshua's curse, he lost his son, but nonetheless he built it anyway. And by the time he established the gates around the city after he rebuilt the city, by that time his youngest had died too. In other words, one gets it's written this way to convey the message that all of his children had died. So as he was building the city, the curse started to fulfill itself, but he continued on in his quest and continued building until he locked the gates around it. And by that time, all of his children had passed because of the curse of Yoshua. Kidvar Adonai asher diber biad Yoshua ben Nun, just as God had spoken in the hands of Yoshua ben Nun, when Yoshua ben Nun made that prophecy and said that curse to the people, but he went ahead and built it anyway. The arrogance, the idea that you're going to go about and do what you want to do, despite the fact that you're literally sacrificing other human beings, in this case your own children, to the cause of your own personal aggrandizement, your own personal wealth, your own personal pleasure, is the idea that makes the idea of idolatry so disgusting, and which is represented by Chiel doing this act. And it's no surprise that this happened under the leadership of Achav, who was the king in the north, that brought the people to this lowest level. I know this chapter was a little long, but a lot of events happened. We're going to start the next chapter with some very interesting events, so stay tuned for the story of Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, and his back and forth between him and Achav and so on. So thank you so much for studying this together with me. Looking forward to studying the rest of this book of Kings, and of course, have a wonderful day.